Um, I am going to turn it over to Glenn and let him get started.
All right, wonderful. It's great to have you all here. Now, my name is Glenn Merrill. Now, some people ask, is it one N or two? And you see on the slide here, it says one N, but legally it has two. My parents always taught me one N growing up. But when I was about 15, I needed my social security card for something. My mom pulls it out of, the box of very important papers and she goes, huh. And she turns around and had two N's. And so my whole life felt like a lie. But, we deal with what we can. I always use one and things like that. But I'm an LCSW licensed clinical social worker, and I do have experience working with opiate treatment and addiction and substance abuse, things like that. I've been working here at Blomquist Hale for coming up on 2 years now, and I just love it being able to work with folks. And like she said, it's any problem. It doesn't have to be work related or things like that. And I kind of describe it as kind of Netflix for therapy, that your company pays for the Netflix subscription and you get to use it, as part of the benefits. So, and I encourage you to use it. I get plenty of people that have never done therapy before, and it's a great opportunity to see what it's like to talk about things, work over, some things, and I enjoy doing it. It's something I find a lot of value in doing and working and helping with people. Now, with this one, you see, what's the deal with opiates? You've probably heard a lot about, the opiate epidemic. You've probably seen some of the billboards around and things like that. And so really what I wanted to talk about today are some of the main things about opiates, why they're a problem, maybe some of the things you didn't understand about opiates, about kind of how things have progressed, as well as we're going to talk about some of the treatment and some of the things that we need to do to help turn some of this around. So as you see here, oh, no, I'm clicking on my email right there. These are some of the overview things that I want to talk about today. What are opiates? How did they affect the body and the brain? Why are opiates so addictive? Why quitting is hard? And why opiates are such a problem in society today. We're going to talk about, some of what's gone on, some of the changes that have happened. We're going to talk a little bit about treatment for opiate use disorder. Like I said, I used to work specifically with opiate treatment, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And like I said, some of the changes, things that maybe we can do or change, and hopefully some things that maybe hadn't thought about, seen about, so that you're going to be more educated, because that's going to be a big part in turning this around. So, opiates, they have been around for a long time. There's references to opium as far back as over 3000 BC. That it's derived from the poppy plant, that it was used, kind of for like smoking. You hear of opium dens, things like that. Even Hippocrates, known as kind of the father of medicine, acknowledged opium's usefulness as a narcotic and painkiller. Opium came to Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. First is laudanum. That's one that you've probably heard about, or if you've watched Amazing Grace, the fellow who helped fight slavery in England. There were issues with laudanum because it's like, oh, here you go, have it, and you see some of the withdrawals and things like that he had to deal with. Also, let's see, it was back in 1803, German chemist Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Seturner, however you pronounce that, was able to isolate the chemical morphine from opium. And morphine was one of it kind of kicked off some of this as well, that it sort of became sort of the go-to pain medicine. Or if you ever watched, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, she'd talk about morphine and that's what they would use and things like that. And then in about 1895, they thought, oh, well, this morphine stuff is pretty addictive. So we're going to find something that's less addictive. And they discovered heroin. Unfortunately, it was not less addictive as they thought. Come on, there we go. Now, opiates have been around for a long time, and they've been a problem for a long time. There's as you see this picture here. Oh, here's the opium den, and here's where we're going to go, and people are going to smoke, things like that. The Civil War, like I mentioned with morphine, that's where it kind of really started becoming the main painkiller kind of in that time frame. And the Civil War survivors became dependent on morphine. It actually became known as the soldier's disease, that they returned from war, battle, or things like that. And to work with the pain, they said, oh, here's morphine. And the dependence kind of kicked in. Now, oxycodone was first approved by the FDA here in America in 1950, and that's when sort of the opiate prescriptions, started to kick off, when it could be in pill form, which made it easier to distribute, to prescribe, and things like that. And then OxyContin, again, one of the other things that really made it rough, really hit the market in the 2000s. And part of what made it such a problem, that it was described as, oh, this is safe for chronic pain. If you have chronic pain, here, you can use this. This is fine. This is safe. When really what we've discovered since then, that it really isn't, that opiates aren't really designed for long-term pain and issues with that. Come on, there we go. Now I want to talk a little bit about how opiates work. Now you notice I've got my little picture here on the left, and these are kind of your normal neurotransmitters. As my high school psychology teacher would say, it's like little skee balls that go from one neuron to the other. And what happens is that the chemicals go from one to the other, and it either sends a signal or will tell a signal to stop, or and depending what those signals are. And you see those are right kind of on the edge there for the neurotransmitters. The opiate receptors are receptors kind of on the side there. You see those little yellow, orange ones on the side. And what the opiate receptors do is they tend to block signals. It's all right, we're done with the signals. Don't let it through. Don't send it through. And so part of how that works is when you have major pain, right? The transmitters are saying, hey, pain, 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 pain. And it's just this constant stream, through the neurons. And so what the opiate receptors do is they kind of say, yes, yes, we know, we get it. Shut up, right? And that's why the pain goes away, is that it's basically telling them, all right, nerves, quit sending the signal. Now, where opiates, also go into, it's not just pain, but it can even be some of like the stress or sensory perception. So what happens is not only am I feeling less pain, sometimes I'm feeling less stress, less worry. Now, this can also affect certain things when it comes to like digestion or other bodily functions. Those opiate receptors deal with a lot of different aspects, but it tends to turn off or slow down. And because a lot of the things that were being sent is, oh, here's where I'm feeling pain, here's where I'm feeling tired, here's where I'm feeling hungry, here's where I'm feeling, all these things. And when the opiate receptor says, all right, stop, turn off, right, we feel better. And now, if that's something where, if I'm in a car crash or something major, that's going to help us to be able to get through. It's going to help us quit, tensing up and that we'll actually hold still when the doctor needs to poke or prod us or whatever we need to do. But this has mental effects as well. So now, just to mention here, that people have used opiates for acute pain, like I mentioned, car accident, surgery. Dental work is another big one. If you get your wisdom teeth taken out, or you have a major extraction or things like that, that's something typically they're going to prescribe an opiate. Now, sometimes they're also prescribed for long-term pain. So if you've got nerve pain, back pain, arthritis, things like that, it's going to fight the pain. But as we're going to talk about today, you're going to see, ooh, here's where this can get tricky. Now, as you see the title on this slide, it says, they became my antidepressant. I remember one of the clients that I worked with, that's how he described what happened with opiates. That not only did it take away his pain, but he felt better. He was able to feel happier, kind of a better outlook on life, that the pain signals and stress signals were reduced by the opiates. And that's pretty attractive, right? Not only do I, not feel the pain, but like life is feeling better, I'm feeling happier, things like that. And so you notice I've got my little diagram here, the problem escape. And so what happens is the opiate, it doesn't like solve the pain, right? It's not fixing the nerves, it's not fixing, the disc that's bulging or whatever it is, but it takes that pain away, right? Because the problem, if I've got this bulging disc or nerve pain or whatever, right, that's the problem. Now the escape, this is the opiate, feels better, right? Just like, if I feel anxious, right, I can, maybe watch something on TV, play a video game or something like that, where I'm distracted for a little while. It takes it away. I feel better, but the problem's not necessarily solved. Now, part of what makes it hard to just stop, right? It feels better, it feels good, the pain's gone, and things like that. But how it really becomes this harsh cycle tends to be once you get dependent on the opiates, and it doesn't take long, right? That if you've been using opiates even for a while, tolerance can increase, and those receptors get very used to having it there. As it was always described to me, was that opiate withdrawal is the worst flu you've ever had times 10. Now, the number would sometimes change, all times 3 times 5 times 10. And they would describe some of these horrible withdrawal symptoms. And to prove that this isn't just, anecdotal stuff, there's actually the clinical opiate withdrawal scale, the COWS scale, which was kind of funny. We talk about, oh, what's your COWS? What's your COWS? But it has 11 different measurements. And they're measuring things like, oh, is there gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, diarrhea, things like that. Are they sweating? Can, if the nurse is taking this assessment, can I literally see the sweating? Are they reporting joint or bone pain? Can I tell that they've got a runny nose? Is their pulse rate up? Right? These are things that you can actively see if someone is in opiate withdrawal. So it's not just in your head, that literally the body is having this effect of feeling like you're, that there is vomiting, diarrhea, things like that, the aches, the pains. And so part of it, number one, that's a horrible feeling. And as you can read here at the bottom, if you think of the worst flu you've ever had, right? If I said, oh, here's a pill, and I'll take it right away. Boom, done. And it does, right? That's one, if you're going through opiate withdrawals, you take that pill or use that substance, smoke, inject, whatever it is, those side effects stop. Those effects stop. And so it's one of those where that's part of the cycle, right? Now, part of it too, I had a great mentor when I was getting my license, and he said, drugs aren't the problem, right? That they're part of the escape, right? Whether I'm escaping physical pain, emotional pain, or things like that. Now, like we talked about with the withdrawal, that's causing more. I'm pointing, like you can see, I'm pointing at this escape part that I'm escaping from that. But now I also have the problem. Ooh, I've got this withdrawal, right? Now I can't get up for work because I'm feeling sick. So I've got to use in order to get to work. If I've got to be able to handle this, and this. I had a lot of people saying, I felt like I couldn't even leave my house without a pill, without doing this, that, and the other, because I would feel so bad and feel so terrible. Now, part of why I bring this up is later when I talk about treatment, a big part of it is, yes, we have to treat this withdrawal cycle, right? To be able to get down to the other problems. All right, what's going on? Is this an anxiety issue? Is this a trauma issue? Is this, what's going on that why you are escaping? Because too often what we say is like, oh, well, you need to stop using the drugs, cut it out, knock it off. And we say, all right, stop doing the drugs, but the problem is still there. Again, whether that's trauma, anxiety, depression, issues with poverty, things like that. If we don't treat those problems, there's still a desire to escape. There's still something we want to feel better. Or even just part of the physical pain. If we're not doing something to see or treat that, this treatment isn't going to last very long. And I'm going to talk again about how this can get worse, right? That many opiate users start with a valid prescription. I had a lot of people talk about how, I got into a car crash, or, I had surgery, broke my leg, whatever it is, and doctor put me on pain medication. Now, what would happen though is they'd be on it, and a lot of people even told me, they said, Glenn, I took it just like the doctor told me, right? I didn't overtake it. I didn't, run out of my prescription early. But then what happens sometimes is the doctor says, okay, time to get off. Boom, done. Or no more refills, we're done. Rather than sort of titrating off or things like that. And people would say, I started to feel bad. I didn't know what was going on. I was feeling some of these withdrawal symptoms, right? Oh, I'm feeling the nausea. I'm feeling these aches. I'm feeling, what's going on. And they're like, what in the world's going on? And so, maybe if they had some left over, or maybe they had a friend, oh, gee, they'd take one and say, there we go. I feel better. And they'd realize like, oh, gee, I don't know how to get out of this or how to stop. And so a lot of people started buying them off the streets, and they would talk about, being able to get them, like, again, sometimes, starting with friends or family or things like that, but getting to a point where it's like, oh, gee, I need, 6 pills today to be able to keep up with this because of tolerance levels, because of withdrawal. Now, I've got some of these prices listed over here. Two of the big ones that we saw used a lot were oxycodone, OxyContin. Now, I circled this right here that you see, it says 15 milligrams. Now, a lot of what I heard from a lot of my clients, a lot of patients were more like 30s, oxycodone 30s, oxys, roxys, things like that. And you see, if each pill on the street, 20, 15 bucks. Now, these are for the 15, right? So 30s are probably going to be a little bit higher, right? And if I have someone who needs, 5, 6 pills a day, that's going to add up pretty darn quick. Now, as we hop over here, then you get supply issues, right? Is my dealer going to have enough? Is my family member going to have enough? Or sometimes it's like, all right, use a couple out of my prescription, while your prescription's out, and then when I refill, you'll get some, and you refill, and you'll give them back or things. And then money issues, right? Now, if the prescription's for 3 a day, but maybe I work myself up to 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 a day, right? That's going to be a lot of money per day. And so what happens, and I heard this story plenty from a lot of my clients, is that they would say, all right, I was up to 10 pills a day. All right, that's $200 a day. My dealer might say, well, gee, one, maybe I don't have enough pills today. Or two, they might say, hey, why don't you save yourself some money? Instead of buying this many pills, why don't you buy 10, 20 bucks worth of heroin? Right? This small amount that's going to do just the same as these, 8 or 9 or 10 pills. So we're like, oh, great, right? I'm using less, I'm saving money. And I hope some of you are laughing and going, hey, that sounds ridiculous. Because what would happen is then you start getting on heroin, and yes, it might have been sustained for that much, but then your tolerance is going to increase, and then the use, and it just spirals. And I got a lot of people but that's how it started, right? And that maybe they couldn't afford it, they couldn't find the pills. So all right, we're gonna switch over. right? And it's not people just starting and saying, oh, gee, I want to go get high. I'm going to go get some heroin, right? And I wanted to illustrate this pathway because, like I said, I heard that story over and over and over again, right? Because a lot of times there's this sort of misunderstanding of this idea of, oh, yes, well, people get into heroin because they were looking to party, they were looking to go get high or things like that. And that is very often not the case, right? That it started with, oh, here's this prescription, here's how it builds, here's how it changes over into this. Now, I want to talk some about the waves of opiates. Right now, if you look at this diagram, I'm going to explain it a little bit. This top line here, this dark one, is opiate overdose deaths of any opiate. Right now, we have under here, we have synthetic opiates. That's this purple one. As you can see, it's almost non-existent at the beginning, but it's the one that's rising the fastest. We're going to talk about that in a second. But this kind of tealish one, this is commonly prescribed opiates. And you notice starting back in 1999, it kind of goes up and up and up and up and up. Right now, on the next slide, we're actually going to see a report about number of prescriptions, basically per 100. And so what happened is, just like I talked about that OxyContin coming out in the 2000s, right? Oh, this is safe. This is great for long-term, pain use and things like that. And that's when it really starts hitting the market. And that's why, right, it's being prescribed more, it's being used more, and it's being abused more. And that's where more of these deaths are coming in. Now, as you notice here, it says wave 2, the rise in heroin overdose deaths, right? Because as we get some of this, oh, gee, opiates are having issues. That's when we see some of the changes in legislation or prescribing habits or things like that, where doctors are like, oh, gee, maybe we shouldn't be handing these out as much or in such quantities and things like that. And so as the prescription amount decreased, right? Oh, gee, we can't get the pill. So what are we going to do? We're going to switch over to heroin. That's when this part goes up, the heroin. Now, you notice right here, wave 3, the rise in synthetic opiates. This is really where fentanyl comes in. You've probably heard of fentanyl. I've got a whole slide on that a little bit later. But fentanyl is a very powerful and potent opiate. And so it's one of those where it's like, all right, if I can buy less and make it last longer, right, or kind of spread it out more and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically on the fentanyl slide. It's one where it was being cut into heroin or other drugs, or even being pressed into pills, to even look like some of these prescriptions. And so really, there's been more legislation about opiates and prescriptions. And so some of that use, I mean, there's still, it hasn't gone back down to pre-2000 levels, but we can see the increase in opiate deaths from fentanyl just skyrocketing. And we'll dive more a little bit into that. Like I said, let's hop over to this next one. And this one, it's, you can see it moving here. This is basically the number of opiates dispensed per 100 people. So you see like this dark red, it says it's over 107 prescriptions per 100 people. So yes, if it's this red, that means there are more prescriptions than there were people. And the data was gathered like kind of by county and by prescriptions and things like that. And so what's wild is you can see for a while, and especially in some of these areas, that there were more prescriptions than there were people. Now, how that works is, someone might have a prescription for 2 different opiates at the same time or amounts or things like that. But especially as you saw, just flip over there from 2020 back to 2006, you can see in these early 2000s, there were just crazy amounts of prescriptions going out, right? And so the availability, the use, and people getting dependent on them, was much higher. And so I'm going to let it go through one more time so you can see kind of how it starts winding back down, right? Because as you saw, that prescription amount going down and the heroin going up coincides with this. And I wanted to illustrate that. I'll see it once more because it's going down. There's been more legislation, especially around 2016, 17, and 18. There's a lot more legislation that went through limiting quantities, amounts, even ranges of time, right? Where it's like, okay, you can only prescribe, 3 to 7 days rather than, 30 days. Okay, now let's dive back into fentanyl. So fentanyl, it works very similar to morphine, but it's 100 times more potent, right? And so what that means is you can buy a smaller amount of it, but you have to be really careful of how much you're taking. So what it tends to happen is it tends to get mixed with other drugs. Often they're pressed into pills to look like legitimate prescriptions. And that's part of why fentanyl deaths can be so hard, right? Because if I press them to look like, oh, here's my oxycodone 15 or 30. Oh, I know what that looks like. I know what color, I know what shape, I know what's imprinted on it, right? Oh, great. I know how many of these I can take a day. But there was a DEA testing where they tested, tons of these kind of counterfeit tablets, and they found they had 0.02 to 5.1 milligrams of fentanyl in them. Now, there we go. I was trying to find, because 2 milligrams can be fatal. You notice I've got this little, this tiny little amount on the end of a pencil, right? That's literally what a lethal dose of fentanyl can be. That tiny amount. I was in a training with a task force officer, a police task force officer, and so he handed out. He had these little vials, and so it's like, all right, here's a lethal dose of heroin. Here's a lethal dose of fentanyl. It's like, all right, is it even in there? I mean, we're talking, if you ever use like kosher salt, I mean, that's about the size we're talking about, these tiny little flakes, right? And so as I was doing some of the research on this, reading about the DEA doing this, because 0.02, all right, cool, that makes sense to sort of expand, my supply and solution, things like that. But 5 milligrams, right? Double what could be a lethal dose, right? And so they said 42, so not quite half of the pills that they tested had that 2.5. So almost half had what could be a lethal dose. And again, there's no tracking, there's no oversight, right? The people who are making this and cutting the drugs aren't saying, well, gee, are we testing these? Are we sure these were safe? I don't think that's their highest priority, right? But that's why we're seeing the death rate increase so much because of fentanyl and how hard it can be and how concentrated it is. Now, how do we treat opiate addiction? Now, just like I said earlier, we can't effectively treat the underlying issues of addiction, whether it's trauma, anxiety, depression, if someone's suffering that withdrawal. I can't say, as a therapist, gee, tell me about your childhood. And tell me about where your anxiety comes from. If they're literally doubled over in pain, and running to the bathroom every 5 minutes. Or if they're falling asleep. That's one where I'd literally be doing intakes in this clinic where I worked at, and people would kind of be dozing off and, things like that as part of withdrawal. Now, what I want to talk about is medication-assisted treatment, or MAT. And basically how it works is you combine opiate medications that basically make those receptors calm down, right? That's where the dependence comes in. We empty up those receptors and they say, hey, we feel bad now. What's going on? I'm going to start feeling sick and terrible. And we have a number of medications that are able to basically calm down those opiates that aren't going to cause, the euphoria, being high, and are able to help them level out so that you can get in with the counseling. All right, what's going on? What are the underlying problems? What are you dealing with by using this medication, using these drugs? Now, the three main phases is going to be stabilization, right? We have to get them to a dose that's going to stabilize them and keep them from going in this withdrawal process. Now, that can be a little tough, right? Because they're coming in and they're probably already withdrawing, and we have to start at a small dose. We don't want to overdose people as well. So you're going to start at a small dose. You're going to work with the doctor to titrate up to a dose that's going to be sustainable for them. And then treatment, that's one where, all right, we kind of get them leveled out, right? They're not going through this withdrawal and back up, up and down cycle. And that treatment is like, all right, what are the underlying issues? What's going on in your life? What's going on with work? Can we get you work? Can we get, housing stabilized and things like that? And then after they get to the stable point, that's when typically we're going to titrate them down. We're going to slowly work them off of that medication, right? Now, two of the main medications used for MAT are methadone and buprenorphine. So now buprenorphine, you're typically going to hear about like Subutex or Suboxone. And that one is typically either going to be in like a pill form, or there's kind of like a dissolvable strip. Typically it's sublingual, it goes underneath the tongue, right? It's not something you just take the pill. And methadone is typically in a liquid form. They're both synthetic opiates, which are prescribed by a licensed provider. Methadone is as from what I understand, the most regulated opiate medication that's out there. And so in order to be able to use that, you have to be in connection with a licensed methadone clinic. And so typically that's, going to have the doctors, it's going to have the counselors, therapists, things like that with that, as well as dosing nurses. Typically how those are going to work is that you go in, you do the intake, you're seen by the doctor, they start working on that. And you typically have to go there, especially at the beginning, every single day in order to dose this medication, right? Because again, that's part of it where you're going there, you're getting the medication, it's calming down these opiate receptors so that you're not going into this withdrawal cycle. And as you work on that, the nurses are going to be taking that COWS, that assessment of how much, where's their withdrawal? Is that something, does it need to keep going up? Does it go down? Are we at the right place? as well as getting the counseling help with the underlying issues. Now, the prescription with Suboxone, that's one where typically it's going to be similar, where you have to see a provider or a doctor that can prescribe that. But that's one where there are some pharmacies where you're able to get that. You don't necessarily have to go, and dose every single day in a clinic. So some people prefer that, if they travel for work. I know we'd get some folks who maybe drove truck or things like that for work. So being able to have a prescription, not having to go every single day to dose, was definitely something that they found appealing. Now, how it affects the receptors, and I'm not going to go into agonists and partial agonists and things like that. Sometimes when the issue is more, say, like heroin by injection or things like that, sometimes the Suboxone or the buprenorphine, because it's a partial agonist, didn't do enough to stop that withdrawal. So sometimes it can be effective, or sometimes it's not enough. But I didn't want to dive too much into the physicality or the pharmaceuticals of that. Now, buprenorphine can be combined with naloxone. So naloxone, some of you might know, that's the Narcan, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But buprenorphine with naloxone is called Suboxone, which reduces its ability to be abused. So typically, like I said, that's going to be a pill that you put sublingually, how we pronounce that, underneath your tongue. But adding the naloxone, that means I can't just crush it up and snort it. Because if I do that, I'm going to get the naloxone, and that's going to basically kick all the opiates out of my brain, right? And so part of that is to try and reduce the amount of, or its ability to be abused. So it's one where that way you can have the prescription. It's much harder to abuse that way. Now, methadone and buprenorphine, when taken as prescribed, do not produce this euphoric or high state, and they don't cause major impairment. Again, you have to take it as prescribed and be titrated and overseen by the doctor. But like I said, being on methadone or Suboxone, having the opiate in your system isn't the problem, right? I know I had some people like, oh, you're just giving them another opiate, and that's the problem. It's like, oh no, the opiate in the system isn't the problem. It's the, spending all your time trying to find drugs, or being high or being impaired or things like that. That's the problem. The opiate being in your system is not the problem if you're doing what you need to do. And so, and as I talked about that, aren't you replacing one opiate with another? I'm reminded of one of my clients that I worked with, and he said, you know what? I remember what my life was like before methadone and what my life is now, right? That's when now he had been on it for years. Now, when it comes to medication-assisted treatment, sometimes it can be a long-term thing. Even, kind of going to a point where it's like, all right, I'm going to get stabilized, I'm going to get treatment, I'm going to get off. Even that process can be a year or more to get to a point where you can titrate, get on the right dosage, and then getting off. Really, the slower the better, right? Is methadone has a very long half-life, 2 days to 2 weeks half-life, because we'd have some people where they just quit showing up to the clinic, and I'd usually call them like, hey, we haven't seen you in a minute, you doing okay? Yeah, I'm feeling great, I think I'm done, and they maybe just hadn't been in 1 day. But then what would happen is 2 or 3 days would go by, and then that withdrawal would start kicking in again. Again, so that's kind of the two-edged sword, that methadone has this long half-life to help keep it stabilized, so you're not going this up and down process. But this fellow, he said, I knew what my life was like before. I know what it's like now. It is better for me to have this stability, right? I had another fellow that I worked with, and I love the way he put it. He said, my family is trusting me again. He talked about one time where, he was talking with his mom, and he needed to go get something. She said, oh, here, take my debit card, and go to the grocery store. And he said she never would have done that before, right? When he wasn't in this medication-assisted treatment. And being able to recognize, here's what's making the difference, right? Now, when it comes to medication-assisted treatment, it's typically a risk reduction point of view, right? That this isn't, let's get all the opiates out, let's stop everything right at once, but how can we reduce the risk? Even on the first day of treatment, some people say, all right, I was shooting up this much heroin every single day. And, even the first couple of days, it can say, all right, instead of shooting up lots of heroin, I maybe smoked a little bit, once the methadone wore off, right? And that's one where it's like, all right, we're getting it down, especially once we get you to that right dosage. And saying, yeah, I don't need to use anymore. I don't feel the withdrawals. I don't feel the urges and cravings, right? And once we get to that point, now we can start working on, here's the anxiety, here's what's going on, right? Now, again, the stability and the predictability. I know how much it's going to cost, right? Most treatment, right? Now, if it's covered maybe by Medicaid, or if it's something where insurance can help, or even if it's an out-of-pocket clinic, it's typically, all right, here's how much it is per week or per month or whatever it is. And I know, here's how much I'm going to pay. I know what I'm getting. I know how much I'm getting. This is medical grade medication, right? And that takes out a lot of the stress or issues or problems that can come with that up and down and hustling. Just like we talked about, having to try and go find pills. Are they the right kind of pills? Is it the right amount? Can I get them at the right time? Whereas typically with this, I know where I'm going. I know what I'm getting. I can get my life stabilized while getting the mental health help that I need. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Narcan. That's one that a lot of people have heard about. Like, oh, here's Narcan. What is it? There's some kind of misconceptions about it, but it's naloxone, and it's a medication where you remember from the beginning those little kind of yellowy um, opiate receptors. Basically, what it does is the naloxone binds to that receptor and pushes everything out. Right? It basically says, "No, me. This is my place," and pushes the opiates out. So how that reverses the opiate overdose, what happens with opiates when you're overdosing is it slows down the signal so much that you basically forget to breathe. Your heart rate basically says, oh, well, nope, we don't need to beat right now, right? Because those opiate receptors are so full of the opiate, which are saying, no, stop the signal, stop the presses, don't go anymore. And so the Narcan, the way it's developed is it sort of can slip in underneath and pokes it out, right? Pokes out all the opiates. Now, it's putting that person into immediate withdrawal, which is not a pleasant experience, but it is going to save them from that immediate withdrawal where they can't breathe, where their heart rate isn't going. Now, it can be administered 3 ways through a nasal spray. That's one of the kind of more common ways when it comes to people having Narcan themselves, family loved ones having that. Muscular injection, so that's like in the shoulders, the butt, the thighs, things like that, where it can be injected. Or it can be administered intravenously. That's something that'd be more like medical professionals might do, say, EMTs, things like that. Now, naloxone is not an opiate, and it can't abuse, it can't be overdosed. Also, it doesn't have an effect if there are no opiates. So if someone, burst into this office right now and shoved a Narcan, nasal spray up my nose and squirted it, it wouldn't affect me because my opiate receptors aren't full of opiates. So, I mean, what would happen is the Narcan would bind to these opiate receptors and they'd have nothing to kick out. And so what's great about it is it's something where you can have, if you have a prescription, if you have a family member, things like that have that, or even someone who uses, opiates, illicitly, heroin, things like that, that you can have that to prevent and to reverse an overdose. And in Utah, naloxone can be dispensed without a prescription. So that way, again, like I said, family, loved ones. There's Naloxone Utah, I believe is the name of the organization, and the clinic where I work. They would provide us with Narcan kits or naloxone kits for us to give out to our clients or patients who maybe they knew that they were still kind of in a rough spot and they were going to overdose, or because maybe they were getting treatment, maybe not their friends or other people that they knew, and being able to have that. It's pretty hardy as well. There's you don't want it too hot or too cold or things like that. But from the training that Naloxone Utah gave us, they said, we've had some that have been sitting around for a long time. They've been up and down, and they've done tests that say, yeah, it's still pretty darn effective, even if it can be a little bit old. But that's one where, now I didn't dive into all the different laws and things like that. But when it comes to some of like the Good Samaritan laws, or I didn't look up the exact name of this one, but when it comes to reporting, because typically what you're going to want to do is if someone is overdosing, I'm not training you on how to do that right now, but if you notice that someone's going to opiate overdose, you're going to administer the Narcan, call 911, right? And when it comes to some of the laws, that you're not going to get in trouble for reporting saying this person is overdosing, right? Because the idea behind that law is, we want people to call and say, yes, this person needs help. We want to save the life. Right. But if someone's worried, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to get arrested, this person's going to get arrested, that's going to disincentivize them to call. But there are laws which I didn't put in the slide here, but that help with some of that, under Good Samaritan laws, or, basically we're trying to save people's lives. But again, Narcan, it's one of those can't be abused, can't be overdosed, things like that. But it's definitely saves lives. Now, what can we do? Is really the biggest part of it is we need to increase education about opiates, especially like when they're being prescribed or things like that. Now, this quote that you see right here, back, years ago when I was getting my wisdom teeth taken out, I had them extracted and they gave me 2 prescriptions. One was for ibuprofen, the big ibuprofens, so more than just over your counter, and then an opiate. And to this day, I don't remember what it was, but here was the extent of my training, warning, or things like that about this opiate. Those are the strong ones. All they said, right? And I had a whole bottle of them, right? Now, I mean, like I said, this has been years ago. I don't remember, but it was a whole holding bottle of them. And it's one of those, because of my history and work with things like that, I look back on that now and I say, holy smokes, because I ended up taking about one and it kind of made me feel loopy. So I thought, no, I'm just going to stick with ibuprofen. I'm going to stick with the ice packs. I don't like that feeling. But I look back and I think, oh, goodness gracious, what if I'd liked it? I remember talking with our doctor, our provider, when I worked in that clinic. He said, oh, yeah, that loopy feeling, that usually means that opiates affect you really well, right? That it wasn't just reducing pain, it was hitting some other stuff. And so it's one like I kind of count my lucky stars that, okay, I had this whole big bottle of them, and if I'd have developed it, who knows what would have happened. Well, like I said, there was no warning, there was no talk of, okay, when you're done, here's how we get off, here's how we're going to step down, or here's what that's going to look like. None of that. There also needs to be an increase of access to treatment. MAT in jails and prisons can reduce recidivism and saves money overall. I wish I had the stats for this. I was in an all-staff meeting in this other agency that I worked at years ago, and it was I want to say it was a jail or a prison in New Mexico that they had done the study, that they opened an MAT program in the jail, and they were kind of following it. All right, who is joining, what's happening, and they followed these people, and they said the people who used that program were less likely to come back to jail. And if they did, it tended to be longer, between times when they came back, and it tended to be for lesser charges, right? And I want to say for each person who took the MAT program, it saved the state about $1,000 is what they had figured. Now, like I said, I wish I could find the numbers for that, but since it was kind of an internal report for a different agency, I don't think I had. But really what it does is, like I said, it's erasing some of these problems or needs, right? That I know what I'm going to get, I know where I'm going to be, I'm feeling stabilized, I can go to work, I can do these kind of things, right? But there still tends to be stigma when it comes to this. Some of the abstinence only programs tend to kind of say, oh, well, you're not really in recovery if you're using those. You're not really in recovery because you've got an opiate. And that can be hard, right? Because they can still, be having productive lives, working jobs, taking care of their families and things like that with this medication in their system. But if there's still that stigma of, I'm not doing it right, I'm not doing it well, that's fighting the wrong thing, if you ask me. Like I said, the having something in your system isn't the problem. What effect does that have? Does that mean that I'm not working? Does that mean I'm not taking care of my kids? Does that mean I'm having to hustle and find and do all these things? Right. I had a lot of that, my clients at that agency say, oh, I'm picking up my medicine, and and I've heard it equated kind of like how insulin helps long-term treat diabetes. That methadone is kind of this long-term treatment for methadone, Suboxone is this treatment for this opiate dependence. Now, I talked about titrating down, and there are people that they would go through this long process, right? I mean, and going down by milligrams, especially with methadone, where if it's a liquid and the dispensing machines can go by milligram. I mean, we're talking maybe a milligram a week or less. And especially when you get farther down, right? If I'm only on 5 milligrams a day, right? 1 milligram is a big jump. So that's something where that might take me 2-3 weeks to get off of. Now, we had success with that of people tapering down. We had other people where they'd kind of hit a wall, depending on the length of time being used or how it's affected the mind and the body. There's some people where it might be something more long-term. But again, just like that fella, I know what my life was like before. I know what my life is like now. I had an excellent job. I had a family, big old house, all this kind of stuff. And he said, this is what helps me function about this. Next one, increased access and education with naloxone, right? That it's one of those that it saves lives. It will reverse that. Now that's one that there needs to be help and treatment, right? I mean, you can't just say, oh, here's the naloxone, now I'm going to go back and use, or things like that. Or just because it's emptied out the receptors, if there's still high amounts of opiates in my body when that naloxone wears off, if I'm not getting the treatment, that's going to cause more problems. But having access, having education to that is going to save lives. Right, there needs to be an increase in research into pain management alternatives. Like I said, in the 2000s, OxyContin was like, oh, this is our long-term, pain management. Not really, because it increases. Typically what's seen, especially with pain clinics, it's like, all right, we've managed the pain here, but because tolerance levels increase, right? There's only so much that you can prescribe and so much that's going to fix that because of how the opiates work. Also, reducing stigma of treatment. That, again, there was a lot of people, oh, you're using it just to get high. No, so much of it started from a place of, oh, here it was prescribed. Now, a lot of the laws have changed now that getting opiates and getting prescriptions is much harder than it used to be. And so I'm hopeful that down the road we're not going to have the same level of problems, but we still have kind of this bridge to gap of people that started when they were being prescribed like crazy, right? And how do we get that treatment? How do we move forward? How do we help reduce that stigma and that shame of seeking out help? And then as we continue to reduce overall opiate prescription and access, hopefully that's going to help things down the road. And as we understand, oh, here's opiates, and yes, there's a place for it, right? If I'm getting, my appendix out, right, I might need that for a day or two after surgery. But recognizing, okay, is that only going to be a day or two, or is that something where, all right, can I see if I'm doing well enough without it? Can I talk about what those options are with my doctor and things like that? Now, I know this is just sort of scratching the surface. I mean, if it was fun doing some of the research and looking at the timelines of, which parts of opiates were developed when and what came around. But really, that's about all I've got today. But I want to give us some time to go over any questions. If you want to throw them in chat, if you want to send them to the BH webinar there, if you don't want to share it directly, if you want to share it with her, she'll be able to send it back over this way. I'm more than happy to dive in with this time that we have left.